More than 100,000 Russian troops were preparing for what Moscow believed would become the decisive breakthrough of the war. Massive armored formations stood ready. Supply trains moved day and night. Artillery batteries thundered across the eastern horizon as the Kremlin poured enormous resources into the Fortress Belt offensive. Russian state media called it inevitable victory. But behind the smoke and steel, something far more dangerous was already unfolding. Deep inside the Fortress Belt, Ukrainian forces were no longer fighting the old kind of war. Hidden underground command centers began tracking Russian movements in real time. Drone operators watched every convoy, every fuel tanker, every ammunition truck. And then, without warning, Russia's entire logistical machine started collapsing from the inside. Convoys exploded before reaching the front. Tank columns stalled in the mud. Entire battalions suddenly lost communication. And this is where the situation became terrifying for Moscow. Because Ukraine wasn't trying to destroy Russia's army head-on anymore. It was trying to slowly suffocate it. The question now is terrifying. Did Putin accidentally lead his own massive offensive directly into a technological death trap? For months, Russia had been preparing for the summer offensive that Kremlin strategists believed could finally break Ukraine's eastern defenses. The target was the Fortress Belt, a heavily fortified network of cities and defensive positions stretching across key regions in eastern Ukraine. Military analysts viewed the area as one of the most strategically important zones in the entire war. Russian planners believed that if the Fortress Belt collapsed, Ukrainian defensive cohesion across the east could begin to fracture. And so Moscow gathered everything it could: mechanized divisions, tank armies, motor rifle brigades, heavy artillery groups. According to multiple military assessments, Russia concentrated more than 100,000 troops for the operation. Some of its most powerful formations were moved into position, including units from the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army and the elite 1st Guards Tank Army. The objective appeared simple on paper: overwhelm Ukrainian defenses through sheer mass, crush the lines with artillery, then force armored breakthroughs deep into the region. Russian media personalities confidently predicted a major victory within weeks. But beneath that confidence, there was a growing vulnerability Moscow either underestimated or failed to understand completely. Ukraine had spent months adapting to a very different battlefield reality. Instead of matching Russian numbers head-on, Ukrainian forces began redesigning the battlefield itself. And at the center of this transformation stood the Azov First Corps and multiple drone warfare units operating across the region. But that was only the beginning. Unlike traditional defensive operations, Ukrainian commanders avoided relying entirely on trench warfare. Instead, they created layered kill zones designed to target the most fragile part of Russia's offensive machine: logistics. Russian doctrine depended heavily on enormous supply flows: fuel, artillery shells, replacement troops, food, medical supplies. Without constant resupply, even the largest armored army could stall within days. Ukraine understood this perfectly, and so the battlefield quietly shifted away from direct confrontation toward something far more dangerous: deep strike attrition warfare. Drone surveillance expanded across critical transportation corridors. Operators monitored railway exits, truck routes, bridges, and rear echelon staging zones. Small FPV drones began hunting individual vehicles with terrifying precision. Then came the devastating pattern Russian units started noticing. Fuel convoys vanished, ammunition trucks exploded, roads became blocked by burning wreckage, drivers refused nighttime missions. Some soldiers reportedly abandoned vehicles entirely after repeated drone ambushes. And this is where the Russian offensive slowly began losing momentum before it had fully started. What military analysts noticed next was alarming. The farther Russian units pushed toward the Fortress Belt, the more exposed their logistical arteries became. Rail systems could move supplies only so far. Beyond that point, Russian forces depended heavily on truck convoys, traveling through narrow roads and devastated terrain. Exactly the kind of environment Ukraine had prepared for. Meanwhile, Ukrainian mechanized brigades held defensive positions, while drone operators transformed the sky into a permanent surveillance network. Russian armored columns advancing near key sectors suddenly found themselves trapped between fortified frontline defenses and relentless drone strikes from the rear. The battlefield was no longer linear. There was no safe rear area anymore, and that changed everything. As the offensive intensified, the Pentagon and Western defense observers began paying close attention to how rapidly drone warfare was reshaping the battlefield. This was no longer simply artillery versus trenches. It was becoming a technological war of persistence, surveillance, and precision disruption. And Ukraine was adapting faster than many expected. Advanced FPV drones equipped with thermal imaging and AI-assisted targeting systems began striking logistical routes deep behind Russian lines. Some systems reportedly operated with extended ranges and encrypted communications designed to resist electronic interference. That detail mattered enormously, because Russia had invested heavily in electronic warfare systems throughout the conflict. The Kremlin expected its jamming platforms and radar systems to suppress drone operations across key sectors. Yet Ukrainian drone teams continuously adapted frequencies, flight paths, and attack tactics in ways that created severe problems for Russian planners. And then came the moment nobody expected. Instead of focusing primarily on tanks or infantry formations, Ukrainian strikes increasingly targeted fuel transport vehicles and ammunition carriers. The logic was brutally effective. A destroyed tank was expensive, but a destroyed fuel network could immobilize hundreds of tanks simultaneously. Suddenly, Russian armored assaults began slowing dramatically. Near muddy southern sectors approaching the fortress belt, armored columns struggled to maneuver. Heavy vehicles became trapped in damaged terrain, while fuel shortages worsened operational delays. Some analysts describe the battlefield as a modern nightmare for mechanized warfare. Massive armored power, unable to move. But the Pentagon had already anticipated this kind of battlefield evolution years earlier. Modern military doctrine increasingly emphasized distributed warfare, drone integration, electronic attack systems, and real-time battlefield intelligence. Ukraine appeared to be applying many of those lessons under live combat conditions. Meanwhile, Russian command structures faced another dangerous complication: communication breakdowns. Drone strikes reportedly targeted signal relays, mobile command nodes, and communications infrastructure supporting frontline coordination. In several sectors, Russian units struggled to maintain synchronized operations across multiple axes of attack. Without reliable communication, artillery response slowed, reinforcement coordination weakened, frontline awareness collapsed, and confusion spread rapidly. What made the situation especially dangerous was the psychological effect. Russian infantry units reportedly spent days under constant drone pressure. Small, buzzing aircraft circled overhead day and night, forcing soldiers to remain hidden for extended periods. Resupply became inconsistent, rotations slowed, medical evacuations became increasingly risky, fatigue started becoming a weapon itself. And this is where the battlefield turned from operational pressure into psychological warfare. Ukrainian drone operators didn't need to destroy every target. Sometimes they only needed to create fear. Fear of movement, fear of visibility, fear that every road, every intersection, every convoy could suddenly erupt into flames. Russian supply routes near major sectors became increasingly hazardous. Convoys reportedly traveled at night without headlights. Drivers attempted improvised camouflage. Electronic warfare teams scrambled desperately to shield advancing units. Still, the strikes continued. The deeper Russia pushed toward the fortress belt, the more costly every kilometer became. And somewhere inside Moscow's command structure, officials likely realized something deeply troubling. Russia's numerical advantage was slowly being neutralized by speed, adaptability, and technology. By late spring, the consequences of the logistical crisis were becoming impossible to ignore. Russia still possessed enormous military strength. Missile strikes continued, drone attacks intensified. Heavy bombardments hammered Ukrainian positions and urban centers. The Kremlin remained capable of inflicting devastating destruction. But battlefield momentum is not measured only by firepower. It is measured by sustainability. And this is where the Fortress Belt operation entered dangerous territory. Entire offensive sectors began slowing simultaneously. Some Russian formations reportedly struggled to maintain artillery support due to supply shortages and disrupted transport corridors. Frontline units increasingly operated under pressure without consistent logistical reinforcement. The offensive machine that was supposed to overwhelm Ukraine now risked exhausting itself. And globally, military observers were watching carefully, because what was unfolding carried implications far beyond Ukraine. Modern warfare itself appeared to be changing in real time. Cheap drones were threatening billion-dollar systems. Small mobile strike teams were disrupting massive armies. Digital coordination was challenging traditional mechanized doctrine. And many defense analysts began asking an uncomfortable question. Could future wars be won less by numbers and more by technological adaptation? But that was only part of the crisis. The geopolitical consequences were equally severe. Every stalled Russian advance increased pressure on the Kremlin domestically and internationally. At the same time, Ukraine's ability to maintain resistance strengthened Western arguments for continued military support. NATO strategists studied the battlefield closely. Defense industries accelerated drone production. Military planners across the world began reevaluating armored warfare doctrines that had dominated global strategy for decades. Meanwhile, the battlefield itself remained brutal. Russian missile attacks continued targeting infrastructure and cities. Ukraine continued relying on layered defense systems, drone strikes, and precision operations to offset Russia's larger manpower reserves. Neither side showed signs of backing down, and this is where the danger of escalation still hangs over the conflict, because prolonged attritional warfare carries enormous risks. Economic strain, military depletion, political instability, potential escalation beyond regional borders. The longer the war continues, the greater the pressure becomes on every actor involved. And yet, despite enormous losses, Moscow still retains significant military capacity. Strategic bombers, cruise missile stockpiles, large reserve manpower pools, electronic warfare systems, long-range strike capabilities. The war is far from over. But the Fortress Belt may represent something historically important, a moment where battlefield dominance began shifting away from sheer mass and toward networked precision warfare, where logistics became more vulnerable than armor, where visibility became more dangerous than firepower, and where small drones hovering silently above the battlefield started reshaping the future of war itself. The Fortress Belt offensive was supposed to demonstrate Russia's overwhelming strength. Instead, it exposed how vulnerable even massive armies can become when logistics, communication, and mobility begin collapsing simultaneously. Thousands of troops remain locked inside one of the most dangerous operational environments of the war. Drone warfare continues evolving. Electronic warfare battles intensify daily, and both sides are adapting faster than many analysts predicted possible. But the most important question still remains unanswered. Can Russia regain the initiative before this slow logistical bleed becomes irreversible? Or has modern warfare already entered a completely new era, where technology and precision matter more than sheer numbers? As the world watches this conflict unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The battlefield of the future may already be here, and it is far more dangerous than anyone expected.